Hey everyone, welcome back. You know how much we love diving into the craft of writing here, and today we're taking a bit of a different approach. We're cracking open The Popcorn Principles by John Gaspard, a book that argues blockbuster movies can teach us a thing or two about storytelling.
Interesting, right? It might seem a little unorthodox, learning from popcorn flicks, but Gaspard makes a really compelling case. There's actually a real art to those movies that keep audiences on the edge of their seats.
Exactly. And it got me thinking, can watching Jaws actually make me a better romance novelist or a thriller writer, any kind of writer at all? That's what we're here to uncover. So where does Gaspard even start with this whole blockbuster storytelling thing?
Well, he jumps right in with a principle that I think resonates no matter what genre you're drawn to.
Yeah.
He calls it stop getting ready and just do it.
Oh man, that one hits close to home. I've got about a dozen half-written drafts that are basically monuments to procrastination.
It's such a common trap, right?
Yeah.
We wait for that perfect moment or that burst of inspiration, but Gaspard argues that sometimes you just have to dive in.
He even backs this up with examples from the film world, right? Didn't he mention movies like Clerks and El Mariachi?
Exactly. Both of those were made on shoestring budgets, proving you don't need a ton of resources to start creating.
So it's really about that initial leap, just getting those words on the page, even if they're messy.
Absolutely. But it's not just about blind action either. Gaspard also emphasizes the importance of, studying your craft. He calls it read, write, repeat.
It's like any skill, right? You're not going to bake a delicious cake without ever having tasted one before. Or studying a recipe at least.
Exactly. And just like a baker experiments with different ingredients and techniques, Gaspard wants us writers to really devour our genre, the good, the bad, and maybe even the ugly.
So it's not enough to just read our favorite authors. We should be analyzing those books that maybe didn't quite hit the mark.
He actually compares reading a poorly written book to dissecting a frog in biology class.
Okay, that's a little graphic, but I get your point.
It might not be the most pleasant experience, right?
Mhm.
But it gives you an understanding of what doesn't work.
Hmm.
It helps you see the mechanics and avoid those same mistakes.
Makes sense. So we've got to put in the work, study the craft, but I think there's another important element that Gaspard highlights, right? Our own unique experiences. He's a big advocate for bringing that personal touch to our writing.
He is. He even quotes director Tom DeSillo, who said, if it ain't personal, it ain't no good. And it's so true, isn't it? Those raw emotions, those personal truths, that's what makes a story resonate.
Absolutely. But how do you balance that personal touch with the expectations of a specific genre? Like, I'm guessing I can't just slap a sci-fi setting on my family drama and call it a day.
Right, and that's where his principle of staying in your lane comes in. When we pick up a book or buy a movie ticket, we have certain expectations based on the genre, don't we?
Yeah.
Like if I'm going for a romantic comedy, I don't want to end up watching a slasher film.
You'd be asking for your money back for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gaspard argues that readers crave that consistency. They're making a contract with the storyteller, agreeing to suspend their disbelief within a certain set of rules. So it's not about stifling creativity. It's more like understanding the genre conventions and using them to your advantage.
But what if you're writing something that blends genres, like a speculative thriller with a hint of romance? How do you stay true to those different elements without confusing the reader?
Well, that's where Gaspard emphasizes being upfront with your audience. Don't try to hide the romance like a dirty little secret. Let the reader in on what they're getting into from the beginning.
So it's all about transparency and trust. That's important in any good relationship, I'd say, whether it's between a writer and a reader or even, a director and their audience.
Totally. And speaking of trust, Gaspard has a lot to say about the role of feedback in the writing process. But we'll have to save that juicy topic for part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back, everyone. Last time we were hanging out in the world of popcorn movies, talking about how those blockbuster hits can actually teach us a thing or two about storytelling. We were diving into John Gaspard's The Popcorn Principles and that whole stop getting ready and just do it mantra.
Yeah, that one really resonated with me. It's so easy to get stuck in that planning phase, but sometimes you just have to take that leap and start getting those words on the page.
Absolutely. But of course, the work doesn't stop there, does it? We've talked about the importance of studying the craft, finding our unique voice. But what about when it's time to actually share our work with, actual humans?
Ah, yes, feedback. That essential but often terrifying part of the writing process.
Tell me about it. My heart practically leaps out of my chest every time I hit that send button, sharing a draft with my writing group.
Gaspard actually compares getting feedback to the way filmmakers use test screenings. It's not about tearing you down. It's more about, seeing your work through fresh eyes.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it. So instead of imagining a panel of critics judging my every word, I should picture myself in a dark theater watching the audience react.
Exactly. And just like a director might tweak a scene based on those audience reactions, Gaspard wants us to view those critiques, those suggestions, as opportunities to make revisions. He even calls it, there's no shame in reshooting.
So even if we think we've written the most brilliant, amazing, flawless first draft, there's always room for improvement.
Exactly. He tells this great story about Doug Liman, the director of Swingers. Apparently, he actually built reshoots into his production schedule, because he knew that sometimes things just don't come together perfectly on that first try.
That's actually really smart. I'm going to have to adopt that mindset. It takes some of the pressure off, I think. Knowing you have the flexibility to revisit things later.
He even talks about David Holtzman's Diary, this film where the director had to reshoot the entire thing because the original footage got stolen. Can you imagine?
Oh my gosh, my worst nightmare. But wait, he reshot the entire film.
He did. And get this, he actually saw it as a blessing in disguise. That forced reshoot gave him a chance to reimagine the whole thing. And
Hmm.
you know what? He ended up making a movie that was even better than what he originally envisioned.
Wow, talk about making lemonade out of lemons. But even when we're open to feedback, willing to make those changes, there's still this one principle that makes me cringe every time.
Kill your darlings.
Ugh, don't you just hate that one? That scene, that character, even that witty line of dialogue, that you're absolutely in love with.
But that just doesn't serve the story.
Exactly.
It's brutal.
Gaspard compares it to that favorite pair of jeans we all have. You know the ones. They haven't fit in years, but you just can't bear to part with them.
Oh, that is painfully accurate. So how do we do it? How do we say goodbye to those darlings?
Well, he suggests trying to view that scene, that character, whatever it is, as its own separate entity. Take it out of the context of your story and ask yourself, does this thing stand on its own 2 feet? Does it add to the overall theme or the character development? So it's about being ruthless, objective.
Exactly. And he gives this really interesting example with the Blair Witch Project. Remember that one? The filmmakers made the really radical decision to scrap most of their documentary style interviews.
Mhm.
They decided to focus on that raw found footage feel instead.
Which, I mean, was a huge risk, right? They were basically throwing away a huge chunk of their film.
It was risky for sure, but it paid off.
Right.
It's what gave the film that sense of immediacy and authenticity. And then there's The Big Chill, where the director, Lawrence Kasdan, really fought for this really long flashback scene. He loved it, but ultimately he realized it wasn't essential to the story.
Oh, yeah, I remember that scene. And I think it was well done and everything, but it did kind of take me out of the present day storyline now that you mention it.
Exactly. Sometimes what we think is crucial is actually holding our story back. But, sometimes the best thing we can do is just step away from our work for a bit. Gaspard calls this one, don't hesitate to hesitate.
Now, that is my kind of writing advice.
Right. It's like when you're working on a puzzle, and you just can't see the solution. Sometimes you've just got to walk away, clear your head, and then come back to it with fresh eyes.
So, what does that even look like for a writer? Are we talking a quick coffee break or a full-on writer's retreat?
It can be anything, honestly. A walk in nature, a movie marathon, even just a good night's sleep. The point is, to give your mind a break from that intensity. Gaspard actually mentions that director Darren Aronofsky used to take his entire editing team to the movies, just to give them a mental break from the post-production grind.
That's amazing. It just goes to show you, even in those high-pressure creative environments, self-care is crucial.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes those moments when we step back, when we give ourselves permission to hesitate, that's when the best breakthroughs happen.
And isn't that what Gaspard's all about? Encouraging writers to kind of break free from those conventional rules and discover their own paths to success.
Absolutely. And speaking of paths, next time we'll be exploring Gaspard's insights on, the wild and sometimes treacherous world of publishing, that final frontier for any aspiring author.
Welcome back, everyone. We're wrapping up our deep dive into the popcorn principles with John Gaspard. It's been pretty amazing, actually, to see how those blockbuster movies, those ones we usually just watch for fun, can teach us so much about the craft of storytelling.
Right. It's like this whole other side of storytelling that we don't always think about.
And we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about finding our voice, embracing feedback, even killing those darlings. But there's one last frontier we haven't explored yet, right? That moment when you're finally ready to share your work with the world.
The wild world of publishing.
Exactly. It can feel pretty daunting, honestly. Kind of like stepping onto the set of a Spielberg movie. You never know what's going to jump out at you.
And Gaspard has some really insightful advice for navigating that world. Like with contracts, for example. He really emphasizes the importance of, reading the fine print.
Okay, contracts, not exactly the most exciting part of being a writer, but I have a feeling it's pretty important.
Oh, absolutely. Gaspard actually compares the entertainment industry to a zoo.
A zoo. Okay, now I'm really curious.
He says it's full of all these different creatures, some harmless, some, well, potentially dangerous. He even warns writers about, like, ruthless gorillas and scavenger hyenas.
Wow. Okay, I get the picture. It sounds like we need to be prepared to face anything.
That's Gaspard's point.
Mm-hmm.
He wants us to go into these situations with our eyes wide open.
So even when you got a successful project, there's no guarantee of creative freedom.
It's tough. He uses the example of the filmmakers behind the Blair Witch Project. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah, totally. That movie was everywhere.
So they had this huge hit on their hands, and they ended up signing this three-picture deal, which, at first glance, it probably seemed like a dream come true, right?
Absolutely. Who wouldn't want a three-picture deal?
Right. But it turns out that the studio really wanted to use those extra films as leverage to get a sequel to Blair Witch made, which wasn't really what the filmmakers had in mind.
Wow. So even when you're standing on that mountaintop of success, there can still be pitfalls.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why, Gaspard's a big advocate for writers seeking legal counsel, especially with those more complicated contracts.
So it's about knowing your rights, making sure you really understand what you're signing.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to walk away if something doesn't feel right.
That's good advice. But what about going a different route altogether? What about self-publishing?
Right. Gaspard actually dedicates a whole section to that. He calls it never needing Hollywood, or in our case, never needing a publisher.
I love that. There's something really empowering about that.
He even quotes this filmmaker, Henry Jaglom, who said, never depend on Hollywood for your financing, for support, for your ability to make films.
That's amazing. It's like he's saying, take control of your own destiny. Tell your story on your own terms.
And, with the rise of self-publishing and all these digital platforms, writers have more control than ever before. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
It is, but it also sounds like a lot of work. Like, how do you even begin to navigate that world?
Well, Gaspard reminds us that time is on your side.
Okay, I like that. So it's not a race.
Exactly. He uses the example of Dark Star, this film that was made by, a group of students at USC. And they actually shot the film really slowly over the course of several years.
Wow, so they were able to kind of perfect their craft and develop their story at their own pace.
Exactly. And Gaspard argues that self-publishing offers that same kind of freedom.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it? That balance between, like, pouring your heart into your work, but also respecting the time it takes to get it right.
Exactly. No compromises.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. I feel like I've learned so much, not just about writing, but also about filmmaking, and honestly about myself as a creative person.
Me too. It's
Yeah.
amazing how these seemingly different worlds, books and movies, they actually have so much in common.
And I love how Gaspard leaves us with this really powerful message in his final chapter. It's called The Best Advice. And he says, the things I've done that have worked the best are the ones I cared about the most.
Isn't that the truth? When you're truly passionate about a story, it shows.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the popcorn principles, I'm left with this thought. Next time you're watching a movie, don't just munch on the popcorn. Pay attention to the story unfolding on screen. You might be surprised at what you can learn.
Happy writing, everyone.
And happy watching. We'll see you next time.